Retina. When they made this one, it was just called a Retina. It wasn't called Retina 1, it was just a Retina. This is the type 117, the first model of Retina made. And you can distinguish this from the 118 because it has this knob on the top. Okay, shall we see what we can see? What's the problems with this one, if any? Focus is a bit rough, but it certainly moves. Let's try the shutter on B. That works. On T. That works. On 1 second. That works. So the shutter works. The focus is moves. The lens is okay. The struts, are they any good? There doesn't appear to be any undue wiggles there. Is it open and shut? Appears to open and shut. Film advance. Right, here's our film advance knob. You'd rotate this. It's connected to not an awful lot. As the film rolls over here, it would turn that sprocket until it locks. I heard that lock in. It's locked the film advance. And now you would cock the shutter, take your photo. And to take your next photo, you need to release the film advance. And you do it by turning this little knob here. Part of a turn. And that unlocks the film advance and you can move on to your next shot. And so on. You can work your way through the film. The frame counter, that will work, that moves when you move this. That seems to work. So on the face of it, we have a camera here that works fairly well. In fact, it works very well for a camera as old as this. This one was made for the an English-speaking market. You can tell because it's got our depth of field scale here is marked in English. The focus scale is marked in feet. Not an awful lot more to say, really. This one's here for servicing. I'll strip it down completely and I'll show you how you go about doing that. Well, the first hurdle when opening the top of the camera to clean under here and get to the film advance mechanism, you need to remove the film advance knob. And to remove the film advance knob, first you need to be able to remove this advance retard rewind lever here. So how's this held in? Well, there are two tiny screws visible here and here. They're a bit clogged up with dirt, which is not at all unusual. That holds a collar, and that collar holds this arm in place, stops it lifting. So first we need to remove those two screws. Right, now nothing's holding this down. So I can lift this up with my fingernails underneath that, there against its spring, rotate it anti-clockwise, and that unthreads it. There was that plate that was holding this in place, and you can see there's a collar around the top of the shaft here, and that plate fitted round there and was screwed down to the knob. Okay, so that's stage one. That's the first part of the fight. This knob, that's left hand threaded. Don't just start turning it backwards to get it loose, you'll break something. You need to put a spanner on the flats on the top of that advance shaft there. Then turn this knob clockwise. That went easily. Suggests to me that someone's been in here in comparatively recent historical times. The rewind knob. Put something through the fork of the rewind knob and then just turn that anti-clockwise. Now that doesn't really want to move. No, it's going. To be a bit cautious about how much force you put on some of the pieces, particularly when you're not going to be able to get spare parts easily. A single screw holds this knob in at the top here, so we'll get that off. This stays on the top of the camera. We have 3 screws here, hold the top cover in place. Nickel plated. They are not flat, they are raised heads, but only slightly raised. Taking great care that the screwdriver doesn't cam out and make a mess of the screws. There are 3 screws here the same. If you make a mess of one of the screw heads when you put the camera back together, put the ugly screw here underneath that knob. No one will ever see it. Right, there's our top cover. Has our viewfinder attached, which I'll take apart later and clean. That's fun getting that back together. Here's the top of the camera, and you can see there's not a lot going on here. I'll remove that shield so we can see a bit more as to what's happening. Now, when you wind the film advance, let's see this. Normally that releases it. As you can see, is when you turn this a quarter of a turn, it lifts this arm out of contact with this cam here. And now you can rotate that, which the direction of the arrow is anti-clockwise. We'll do that. And there's nothing. There's nothing to prevent that rotating clockwise because nothing else engages with it. When enough film is pulled through it, is rotating this sprocket, you'll see that it rotates this piece, which rotates this top disc. As it comes around, it allows that to drop in. As that drops in, this thing here locks that on that ratchet wheel, so the film advance cannot be rotated any further. Your film at that stage is advanced, it's ready to take a photo. You cock the shutter, release your shutter. To wind on for the next shot, you turn this piece, turns about a bit less than a quarter of a turn. That lifts this arm out of contact with that gear, and then you can rotate your film advance again, winding the film through the camera. And of course, as that's winding through, the film is winding the sprocket wheel here, and when it reaches this point, it locks the film advance again. All very simple stuff. And because it's simple stuff, there's not an awful lot to go wrong with it, but there are 1 or 2 points to watch. Start by lifting off a few loose bits, I suppose. We can take that top piece off. And this one underneath, is that held by that screw? I think it is. So that's quite a wide slot on the top of that piece. And I'm not sure my screwdriver would span that. Let's see if we can cheat and use... And scalpel blade doesn't want to move it. Scalpel blades, of course, are a bit fragile. They're a bit brittle. So I've got to get that loose. I might cheat and use a pair of pliers to do that. These pliers lack any serrations at all, so they're not going to make a mess of this. And I'm going to put a piece of this sticky rubber sheet on there and see if that'll come loose. Well, it's not keen. It is most certainly not keen. Did we move that at all? No. Alright. That I want off, and that does not want to move. Oh, more brutal methods will be required. Well, I did get it loose, and what I used was a spudger. And I simply placed the blade in the slot, gave it a good twist, and that came loose. Now I can probably spin that out with a screwdriver. Yeah, it's reluctant. Okay, so there's our post. We can lift this off. You can see the gear under there, where it's driven by the sprocket over here. This piece, this arm, the control arm. I think we'll take the top off here first. That's the frame counter. I'm going to try this again. Yep, that came loose. That comes off. This arm is held in place with a spring over a screw head there. You can probably unhook that spring from the arm, I think. Yep. And we've got a single screw. Being very careful not to let screwdrivers cam out on any of these screws. Now that spring's wrapped around a groove in the head of that screw, so the screw doesn't want to go away completely. That's okay. So what else have we got here? I'll take these two screws out and we'll lift that rewind post out so I can clean it thoroughly, lubricate it before it goes back in. This spring here is for the frame counter. Basically it engages with these notches here and stops this rolling backwards, so that as it's advanced by the frame counter mechanism here, it can't back up again. That's all. Leave that alone, because if you muck with the adjustment of this, you may find that it's awkward to get it right again afterwards. And there's no reason to get that off there. Okay, so I want this off the top of the film advance shaft. There's flats on the shaft around here, and this is just sort of pressed on, so it may or may not come off without a fight. I'll slide a couple of screwdrivers in here. Yeah, that lifted out easily, no problem. Alright, so there we've got our little ratchet gear with the flats. A flat disc there went underneath, and the film advance shaft here is held into the body with 3 screws. There's not in a hurry to lift out for one reason or another. Let's find out why. I can't see any reason. see if this will come up. Right, there's the outside. It's got a slot in it, and a slot, there's a spring that engages with that slot. Is that spring catching on something here? It could be. It's not caught by the take-up spool. There must be some roughness on that shaft. Oh, it's coming. Here we go. Okay. So here. This is the take-up spool, and if you look inside there, you just about see on the camera there's a pair of ramps. They're engaged by this piece, and when that's down, it engages with them. This is pushed down into place with this spring, so that acts to keep it engaged. Now what happens if we put this together? Is our advanced retard lever on the top. When it's turned to the advanced position, this little cam here is down low. It engages with these slots here and it can drive the take-up spool. When it's set to the rewind position, this cam lifts up. It's no longer engaged with this, and it means that the spool can revolve around to allow you to rewind the film. The counter mechanism, the sprocket over here, that'll roll in either direction. That's not causing you a problem. Now there's something else to note here. We'll just get rid of this, take those pieces out. There's a spring wrapped around this shaft. It's got a small tab that sticks up on the spring, and that engages with a notch here in this body. Basically it's an anti-backup spring. It means that you can revolve the shaft in one direction, but as soon as you try to revolve it in the other direction, it effectively tightens that spring on the shaft and blocks you from doing so. It's not at all uncommon to find that the end of this spring is broken off, and it gets broken off because people don't set the rewind position correctly, and then they start rewinding the film into the cassette. If they apply enough force, basically they're forcing this thing back against the spring which is stopping it, and the end of that spring snaps off. And the answer is simply to bend up a new end on the spring. It's not at all difficult to achieve. It's very difficult to get a short end on the spring like that. You tend to end up with it slightly too long, and then you have to grind it back down so that it doesn't stick through too far through here and foul the casting. But otherwise that's it. So there's not an awful lot to that. I'll zoom you out a bit. Let's see these pieces we've got on the bench. So the film advance pieces are all pretty simple. In servicing the camera, all of this has to be cleaned. The grease that's in here is all dried up, plenty of dust and rubbish in it. The sprocket here, there's probably no joy in taking that apart unless there's some obvious problem with it. I'd say just leave it alone. If you want to take that out to clean it, there's a tiny screw here. You need to take that screw out, and then the shaft lifts out from here. I don't think there's a washer in this case. Sometimes you may find a fine washer between here and the body, but there doesn't appear to be there. But there's nothing to do there really. So at the top of the body here, basically it's just getting in with a dry paint brush, getting rid of all the dust and sand, then cleaning this with some naphtha, making sure you get rid of all the old grease. There really isn't much to the film advance mechanism in this model. And of course it's entirely independent to the shutter, which is cocked here and released here, and just like that. And if this had its plunger, because normally they have a plunger, the plunger would sit here, so you'd cock this and this would be your shutter release. It's a bit easier to get to. Those plungers are very often missing. Some of them simply got lost. That's not at all uncommon for things like that to unscrew themselves and get lost. Some of them would have been snapped off when somebody did something silly, and it's quite likely that some of them were removed from the camera because the plunger sticking out of your shutter would have been regarded as very old-fashioned at some stage down the train, and people would have removed them completely to think of the camera as being somewhat more modern than it really was. Cosmetic problems. What have we got with this camera? Well, you see here the paint is pretty uniformly gone on the inside of that door. That's steel there, and you can see the surface rust. It's worse on the inside than it is on the outside. It may well be that this camera sat somewhere on display, open, for many years, and basically just dust and humidity have caused that. You get a build-up of dust, and then that holds moisture from humidity changes, and that's caused that to rust out. Probably something along those lines. It's certainly rustier than the outside of the door, which is certainly not stunning looking, but it doesn't look like that. To deal with this, once it's all apart, I think that a quick blow over with a spray paint would sort that out. I don't recommend stripping the leather unless you're really into looking for an adventure. Getting the leather off and back on again without ripping it is sometimes quite tricky. This can be quite thin. Actually, in this case it looks relatively robust, but I'm still not going to be delving into that. I think I'll clean this off, look at spraying it, and I'll just mask off the leather when I do that. Anything else to note? Not an awful lot really. The focus on the 117, the infinity position, your focus knob is always there at the 7 o'clock position, not at the 5 o'clock position as you'd find with later retinas, and I'm thinking of the type 010 is when that started. So it's always there. And of course, like any retina, you're supposed to have the focus back at infinity before you close the camera. It's there may be a lock in here, I can't remember, but it's easy to do this at any other position. And things don't want to go, you'll find that the shutter starts biting into the door. So you need to make sure this is returned to the infinity position, and then things open and shut nicely. Well, I'll carry on stripping this thing down and cleaning everything. Getting this spring off here is proving to be entertaining. Just following it round with a screwdriver tip, encouraging it off the end of this shaft. Of course, there's a slight a groove in that shaft, which is probably a wear groove from the last coil of the spring, but the spring is falling into it and being reluctant to come off. I want this off because it's quite gritty under here. I want all of that grit out, and then I'll need to lubricate that with something quite useful. I think graphite grease would be a goer. Molybdenum paste certainly would be another good choice. There, it's off. Okay. Right, so the parts I've got here that I can throw in the ultrasonic cleaner are those that have no paint, because the paint comes off if I put anything with paint in there, it's likely to come off. So it means that knobs like this, where the engraved arrow has got black paint in it, likewise here the advanced knob, I'm going to have to clean those manually, the frame counter and the rewind. It's not clear whether there's actually black paint in those engravings or whether it's dirt, but I'll err on the cautious side and not put it through the cleaner. Likewise the engraved arrow in there, I don't actually know whether that's black paint or whether that's just dirt I'm seeing in there highlighting that out. Still, I'll work my way through it. So I'll get these pieces cleaned. There's nothing exciting about the cleaning. Cleaning's just done with naphtha typically. And I just want rid of all the old grease. The old grease will be filled with grit and dust particles, which are just abrasives basically. They're not useful as lubricants. And when it goes back together, it'll go back with clean stuff, clean lubricants. And this part here, I'll just clean that manually. Now this is in good order. The little point on the end that engages with that ratchet wheel from the Film Advance is in good order. Sometimes you might find these are a bit chewed off through abuse, the usual. I mean, most of these things, this camera looks well used to me. It was probably in service for a long time, it's done a lot of work, it's been well cared for. They haven't always been well cared for. And the top cover, this one has a separate front and rear frame. Now one of those at least is glued in place. Yeah, the rear frame's coming out. Yeah, it's just a little rectangular brass frame. It has the rear eyepiece lens there. It's got folded over edges holding that in place. Since that's removed so easily, I don't really need to do an awful lot, I think, here. There's a loose plate here which these two screws run into. This front frame is probably just glued in as well, or it might be trapped in with under that plate, I'm not sure. Anyway, it's fairly secure at the moment. Hopefully it'll stay secure. This rear eyepiece, you saw how easily that came out. I just ran my fingernail around that lifted straight out. It's not uncommon to find cameras where that's gone, and you may find that some foreign object has been used for the eyepiece. I mean, I've made frames like that myself to do the job. It's a tedious process, and the rear eyepiece glass from any of the Retina ones typically would serve in that place, as long as you've got some way of fixing it. So this is a bit dusty and dirty, but nothing radical. If you were going to restore, if you were going to kid yourself that you were going to restore one of these cameras and make it look like new, you would probably dismantle all of this, strip all the paint, make sure that the surface was good, and repaint it from scratch. This one, I can see when I hold it to the light, you can see there that this edge has been repainted with a brush. Certainly some marks on the other edge there, suggesting that received some attention. There's a slight crease across the top here. That means that it's been thumped at some stage. Whether that was done at the same time the paint was lost or not, it's hard to tell. The rest of the paint on this top cover looks good and it looks original. Around the body, of course, these are black lacquered body edges. Generally speaking, that's in good shape. Around the base edges here, that looks like that's been repainted. I'm not sure whether all those edges were painted originally either. However, I'll get to and clean these parts.